Those of you who became adults in the 1970s, as I certainly did, may recall this famous book, Future Shock, by Alvin Toffler, actually by Alvin Toffler and his wife Adelaide Farrell, but in the 1970s, women didn't always get all the credit they deserved. The premise of the book is that our society at that time was suffering from a kind of psychological shock that came from how fast the world was changing. And granted, as I've mentioned in the past, my parents were born in 1920 into a world of oil lamps and horse and buggy transportation, and then lived through World War II and the invention of commercial aircraft and the commonplace automobiles, electric lights, and then finally, by the time they passed away, computers and the internet were in force. And my mother played solitaire no longer with a deck of cards, but with an IBM computer. One is forced to wonder, though, what Toffler and Farrell would say about the third decade of the 21st century. News is happening so fast this year that I have wondered aloud at times if journalists will even remember how to go out and find a news story once news stops raining on them like a ton of bricks every day. But today, rather than commenting on the important and in many ways earth-shattering events that have taken place in our American history in the last few weeks, I'd like to pull the lens back and not get sucked into talking about our current wars or the election or the threat or promises offered by technology, but to think about the trend of how our country is evolving and how it is impacting the world's poor, the amount of suffering that goes on in the world. My first memories of my family evening ritual was to eat a very early dinner, almost the minute my dad walked in from work. And then after dinner, we would gather around the black and white television in the den to listen to Walter Cronkite telling us what had happened in the world. There not only was no 24-hour news stations back in those days, initially there wasn't even an hour of news. Walter Cronkite had 30 minutes every weekday to tell us what had happened that day, whether it was the assassination of John Kennedy or Bobby Kennedy or Martin Luther King Jr. The moon landing got extended coverage, but that was because they predicted coming out of the capsule hours before they actually did. But we got a pretty cursory view in 30 minutes of what had happened in the world, but always included every day was a report on the number of American casualties in the Vietnam War. The reason given for that seemingly endless war was to stop the spread of communism. And maybe to a certain extent it was that, or that was at least part of the motivation, since China and the United States were using North and South Vietnam to fight a proxy war against one another that was finally settled, honestly, oddly enough, by ping pong matches. But that story is way too long to go into today. Suffice it to say that for most of our lives, politicians have at least pretended to be engaged in some grand battle between capitalism and communism, or communism's little sister, socialism. Most of the conversation around these economic systems has been carried on by people who wouldn't know a socialist if one stood up in their soup. They have no idea what the real issues are. When a politician suggests that state universities should be tuition-free, and someone immediately claims that that would be socialism, or if they're really mad about it, they say it would be communism, even though very few people would ever suggest that tuition-free kindergarten through high school is a socialist plot of any kind. No one could win a local election if they started calling all school teachers socialist, even though technically they would be accurate. Our public schools are supported by taxing citizens, whether they have kids in school or not. We pay for our schools out of property taxes in most cities, and that's on me, even though I haven't had a kid in public school for over 25 years. At its most basic level, our school system is socialist. But then so is our Congress and our Senate, our Supreme Court, and even our president, all of whose salaries are paid out of taxes collected from citizens. But then the largest budget item in any city government is their police force. Our police, our firefighters, our highway department, they're all socialist, as is our Army, our Navy, our Air Force, and Marines. We tell ourselves that we are a capitalist country, but a whole lot of our economy is based on a socialist system. And in fact, our capitalist society couldn't make much of a profit if it weren't for the socialist systems of building roads, police, firefighters, airports, and the whole matter of federally managed banking and commerce, without which capitalism couldn't exist. But the misunderstanding really goes farther than that. Regardless of whether your salary is derived from tax dollars, if you are working to support yourself, if you need a salary from an employer to pay your rent, to buy your groceries, to provide your family with a car, whether that check comes from Walmart or Amazon or Ford Motor Company, then you're not a capitalist. You are a laborer. You are working for a salary, which you then use to support the basic needs of your family, hopefully with a vacation thrown in there. And sure, most of us have pension funds that are invested in stocks, but that doesn't make you a capitalist. A capitalist is someone who derives their living from the investment of capital. The engineer at Apple, who is right now designing the next iteration of our iPhone, is not a capitalist. But Paris Hilton is a capitalist. The Hilton family isn't engaged in changing the sheets in hotel rooms or even working at the front desk handing out keys. They are owners of a great deal of wealth, and they derive a lavish lifestyle from their investment of capital. Because the words communism and socialism have been used like curse words in our political discourse, we have come to accept that capitalism is an assumed American value. It's mom, the flag, and apple pie. Whenever someone starts to criticize capitalism, they are setting themselves up for being labeled a socialist, and by that, just being labeled that, without any proof, without any evidence, without any explanation of what socialism really is, they are then exiled, considered to be un-American, or at least unaware, but probably crazy. The most famous proponent of more socialist values and the way in which America uses capitalism is the Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, who has now made 2 runs at the Democratic nomination for president, the first in 2016 and the second in 2020. But he's even older than Joe Biden, so I don't think we'll ever see him running for office again. But he's still writing best-selling books, which is kind of an odd thing for a socialist to be doing, because now Bernie Sanders has made several $1 million based on his books, and I'm guilty of buying them myself. Capitalism has some funny quirks to it, you know. I just got my royalty check for the 3 books that I still have in print, my check for the entire year, but don't worry, folks, I'm still not a capitalist. But Bernie was sidelined in both of his runs for the Democratic nomination, largely because he was publicly maligned as being crazy. I don't know how many good friends told me with confidence that Bernie is crazy. It wasn't just Trump calling him crazy Bernie, but leading Democrats said a lot of the same things, including Hillary Clinton claiming that absolutely no one likes Bernie and that he was driving her crazy. I accept that Bernie Sanders is a tad eccentric, and there have been a number of odd twists and turns in his career, but for me, really, Bernie is not the issue. His wild hair looks like he combs it with a balloon. That has nothing to do with the dimensions of either good or evil in the changes that he proposes to capitalism. In fact, if we took these issues that he was proposing one by one and put them up to popular vote, I am firmly convinced that all of them would pass with majority approval from the public. The issue that seems to get most politicians all twisted up has been his suggestion that we have Medicare or something very like it for all Americans, because the whole healthcare industry is such a cash cow for billionaires, and then a source of political donations for both Republicans and Democrats. Even some of the most liberal and progressive of Democrats are supported by pharmaceutical companies and health insurance companies. So both sides of the political fence insisted that his suggestion of Medicare for all is crazy. So crazy, in fact, as one popular meme on social media has noted, it's only been successfully implemented in 32 of the 33 Western democracies in the world. Every other developed country has managed to do it, but Americans still say it's crazy to suggest that it could be done here. When Bernie lost the nomination to Biden in 2020, he actually had a meeting with President Biden to discuss the issues that Bernie was really trying to present in his campaign. There were 10 of them, and he and Biden agreed on half of those. They agreed that the federal minimum wage really should be raised to $15 an hour, including restaurant workers. They agreed that Medicare should be able to negotiate the price of pharmaceuticals. They agreed on the need to be more aggressive about combating climate change, and Bernie even wanted to create a workforce of young people who were giving 2 years of service to an organization to work on sustainable climate changes. And if we couldn't have Medicare for all, Bernie was asking that we lower the enrollment age at least to 60. You could see how we could incrementally, year after year, lower the age until we got to the point where everybody was covered. And finally, they agreed that we should stop using private prisons and detention centers where people are making a profit off of incarcerating Americans, oftentimes making certain that if they serve their prison service, they're going to have to come back again. Now, does any of that sound crazy to you? Again, Biden even agreed on 5 of those issues, though it's evident now that he will be leaving office at the end of his first term that he hasn't been able to implement them. But what are the 5 crazy things that they couldn't agree on? Of course, they didn't agree on Medicare for all, even though most Americans would vote for it in a New York minute. They did not agree on legalizing marijuana, even though this is happening in a state-by-state process in even the darkest of red states. They couldn't agree on forgiving all student loans, though Biden has certainly tried to take steps in that direction. They couldn't agree on making state universities tuition free, even though 24 nations have already done it, and that list is growing every year. And among Americans, this would be a wildly popular initiative, maybe even more popular than legalizing marijuana. And the final issue where they could not agree was imposing a wealth tax on billionaires. So I have to ask you, even in these issues that Biden and the Democratic Party wouldn't support, does any of it actually sound crazy to you? Now, it might hurt some of the people who make the big political donations, but should we be allowing people to just purchase elections or to buy legislation the way that we do? The profit motive inherent to capitalism certainly inspires innovation, and it can spur people on to work hard, to get another degree, to try to get a promotion, to save money, and to increase the total wealth of the world. But if it is not governed in a way that keeps redistributing that wealth, the greed that drives capitalism leads naturally to hoarding resources. There are lots of ways of trying to describe how this is happening, but one simple, concrete way that Bernie Sanders uses in his most recent book is to say simply that there are three people, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and Warren Buffett, who control as much wealth as the bottom half of the country. They have as much wealth as more than 160 million Americans. The existence of poverty in this wealthy nation would presume, even though we're the wealthiest nation in the history of the world, that there's still not enough. We don't have enough resources to lift everyone out of poverty. But that, men and women, is simply not true. The problem is a convoluted tax structure that year after year has been altered under the influence of very wealthy political donors to serve the interests of the wealthy. This is allowing them to hoard so much of the nation's wealth that they literally could not spend it all in 100 lifetimes. What creates poverty in America? It's not a shortage of resources. Poverty is caused by hoarding at the top by the most wealthy people. These three familiar billionaires, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Richard Branson, have so much money that they recently designed spaceships so that they could take a personal ride in space. And there are 5 more billionaires with similar plans in the works. I understand that capitalism will create multimillionaires who will own several houses and yachts and every luxury imaginable. Even in this community where I live, the nice houses that are near the beach, most of them stay shuttered 10 months out of the year because they're some very wealthy person's second house, even though it may be 9, 10, 12,000 square feet of house with a dozen bedrooms and more than a dozen bathrooms in them. They have hurricane shutters on the windows, and their yacht is dry docked somewhere away from the dock in front of their house. I realize that's going to happen. Some people will be able to make capitalism work so that they literally have disposable income that they spend on things that they rarely ever use. But is there any reason why any one person should be able to become a billionaire? Is there a reason that anyone should be so rich they could build a spaceship and shoot themselves into space when they've got employees that cannot even buy reliable transportation to just, for example, get to the Amazon warehouse where they work? When Jeff Bezos landed after his brief journey in space, he thanked all of the Amazon employees who made it possible. Do you think they ever decided that that's how they wanted their labor to go for? Wouldn't they have preferred to have better working conditions, more vacation time, better health insurance, and a higher salary? When the Walton family built this fabulous art collection and art museum in Bentonville, Arkansas, one of the Waltons was interviewed for a local radio station, and she explained, America has made it possible for us to gain this wealth. We just wanted to find a way to give back. Well, let me suggest a way to give back. Pay a decent salary to your employees. Provide health insurance. Let them unionize. Let them organize so that they can have better working conditions, better hours, and better compensation. The wealthy can afford tax avoidance schemes like offshore bank accounts. If you've ever been to the Bahamas, Take a ride along the beach and you will see bank after bank after bank after bank in sparsely populated islands. The same I know is true in Panama. There are banks all over the Caribbean housing money of the super wealthy in the United States who are avoiding paying taxes. But the single mom who's making your coffee at Starbucks, she doesn't have an offshore account. She doesn't have lobbyists that are trying to change tax laws in her favor in Washington, D.C. The people who are poor are afraid to organize into unions because they don't want to lose their jobs. They're afraid to complain about their working condition or their salaries because they have to have what work that they've got. There is not a scarcity of money in this country, but there is a very clear paucity of compassion and, frankly, of logic. This problem has become much worse in the past decade. With even the majority of government spending to get us through the pandemic in 2020 and 2021, most of that money ended up enriching billionaires while millions of Americans lost income or lost their jobs entirely. Those 2 years of the pandemic saw the greatest transfer of wealth from the middle class and the poor up to the wealthy than any other time in our history. Why was it even legal to profit from the pandemic? A pandemic which ended up killing 1 million Americans. During World War II, Franklin Roosevelt tried to structure the tax system so that no one would have insane windfall profits from their manufacturing for the war. The war that cost so many people their lives should not have been a source of income for anyone. While we were still engaged in fighting World War II in 1944, President Franklin Roosevelt proposed a second Bill of Rights in his State of the Union address. Franklin acknowledged that the Bill of Rights that are the first 10 amendments to our Constitution, while they are important, that those 10 political amendments, Bill of Rights, had failed to guarantee freedom to Americans and had not provided to them the ability to actually engage in a pursuit of happiness that is declared as a God-given right in the Constitution. If you are so poor that you cannot gain access to safe housing, to needed medical care, to adequate food and education, then you're not really free. Everyone who has had to endure abusive working conditions out of fear of unemployment knows what it's like to not really be free. You are a slave to the salary. Roosevelt said, people who are hungry and out of a job are the stuff of which dictators are made. That is how people become desperate enough to vote for despots and tyrants. Of course, Roosevelt was not able to implement these goals, and even though he delivered that speech 80 years ago, we still haven't gotten there. But he insisted that every American has a right to meaningful employment and that such employment should pay enough to provide safe housing, food, medical care, and recreation, because life is about more than going to work. And that farmers, he specifically named because it was still very much an agrarian economy, that farmers should be guaranteed sufficient prices so that they were not constantly threatened with price drops at the time of harvest, so that they spend an entire year growing crops that then they sell at a loss. Every farmer should be guaranteed an adequate profit for their crops that allows them a decent life. And he said that every small business should be protected from large monopolies and unfair corporate competition. He also named access to education and protections in old age from illness, hunger, or homelessness. Roosevelt saw the end of the war coming and that they would be bringing home hundreds of thousands of soldiers who couldn't assume that they would have access to education or employment. And if so, That begs the question why they had to go fight in a war in the first place. What were they defending if they could not come home to freedom? If you're going and risking your life, and many, of course, losing their lives or limbs, and then have to come home and sleep under a bridge, is that freedom? In the years since this second Bill of Rights was suggested, we have seen Walmart and Amazon gobble up the marketplace and shut down almost all locally owned retail stores. Even grocery chains are never owned by people that live in the community. Family farms have been consolidated into corporate operations so far that the subsidies that have been put into place that were to help save family farms is now almost all going to the 5 major food corporations in America and not to the poor farmers they were intended to help. Do you know who the largest owner of farmland in America is? It's Bill Gates. And Bill Gates is not a farmer, but he owns more than 270,000 acres of farmland. Why? I'm not suggesting that Gates has any nefarious plans for all this farmland. I accept his explanation that his intention is simply to make these farms more productive and more profitable. That's what rich people do. But it's still driving farmers off of the land and consolidating wealth into the hands of fewer and fewer people, which clearly isn't sustainable. If this continues, can Bill Gates own all of the farmland in America? At what point do we put up sufficient guardrails around capitalism to make it work so that it enriches the entire country and not just a handful of the super wealthy? Capitalism, if we allow it to, will destroy capitalism. Capitalism will eat its own children. In order to sustain a market, you cannot only think about what is best for the next quarterly financial returns. To have an economy, you have to have consumers who are able to buy things. To have an economy, you have to pay people enough for them to be able to acquire the things that our very productive corporations are able to manufacture. Wages have to be sufficient, both for people to survive and for them to enjoy survival. There is more to life than just going to work. If, men and women, it is possible to end poverty in America, then there remains no moral justification for not doing it. I realize that's just my opinion, but you and I know I also happen to be right.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.